today's mindful moment. Ready for a real eye-opener. The wealth gap between black and white Americans is as wide today as it was back in 1968. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
Despite all the progress we've made with civil rights, this deep-rooted inequity just keeps hanging on. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the 1619 Project. It's a powerful collection of essays, poems, even personal stories that flip the script on American history. It puts the legacy of slavery and the often overlooked contributions of black Americans right at the center of the story.
Exactly. It's not about erasing history. It's about understanding how this legacy is woven into every part of our nation. It's still shaping our world today.
Right, and we've got this incredible mix of sources to work with. Historical essays that really lay out the facts, poems that hit you right in the feels, and personal stories that make history come alive, real people's experiences. The mission here is to uncover the story of Black America, the story we don't always hear, from that pivotal year, 1619, all the way to now. And it's wild because even in my own education, Black history was kind of missing. Like, we learned about Jamestown, sure, but the arrival of those first enslaved Africans, crickets, never mentioned.
And that's the heart of what the 1619 Project wants to change. It argues that 1619, the year those first enslaved Africans were brought to the English colonies, is as important as 1776. It reframes everything, showing how slavery isn't a footnote. It's foundational to the very idea of the United States.
It's almost like we've been looking at American history through this, a warped lens. And it's not just about what's left out, it's how it's told. The project even points to a textbook, a McGraw-Hill textbook, that called enslaved Africans workers. Workers. I mean, how can you even...
It's subtle, but it's a powerful way to downplay the horrors of slavery. Calling them workers erases the violence, the force, the fact that they had zero freedom. It's like saying the pyramids were built by, highly motivated employees. It just doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's completely sugarcoating the truth. And speaking of uncomfortable truths, the 1619 Project also digs into this paradox. Freedom and slavery during the American Revolution. How could a nation fight for liberty while keeping millions in chains?
It's a contradiction right at the core of the American story. The Revolution, sure, it was about liberty and self-determination, but for many colonists, it was also about keeping slavery alive and well. They were terrified of Black liberation, and that fear shaped the whole nation.
So you've got these big, lofty ideals of freedom, and then this brutal reality for millions. It makes you wonder what freedom really meant back then and who it was really for. There's even the story about Lord Dunmore. He was the royal governor of Virginia, and he offered freedom to enslaved people who joined the British side.
And hundreds took him up on it. They risked everything for a shot at freedom. It shows just how complex things were. Enslaved people saw the hypocrisy, and they saw a chance to break free.
It flips everything on its head. Suddenly, the enemy becomes the hope for freedom.
And that leads us to the legacy of slavery in America today. It's not some dusty old relic of the past. It's still having a huge impact on Black Americans.
This is where the rubber hits the road. We're talking about economic systems, structures that were born from slavery, and they're still fueling inequality today.
Think of it like this: a line of racial control changing over time. From slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, the systems of oppression might look different, but the goal stays the same: control and exploit Black labor and Black bodies.
And it goes beyond social structures, right? The 1619 Project argues that even the Constitution, especially the Three-Fifths Compromise, was designed to protect the interests of those who profited from slavery. Could you break that down a bit?
Sure. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a deal made at the Constitutional Convention. Basically, it said enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person. This was for representation in Congress and taxes. So Southern states, with their large enslaved populations, got more political clout than they should have.
They literally dehumanized Black people to gain power. It's sickening.
And it set a dangerous precedent. States' rights over federal authority. That dynamic fueled all the conflicts over slavery and civil rights that came after. You can see echoes of it today in debates about voting rights, federal power, and racial justice.
It's a powerful reminder that those compromises made to appease slaveholding states centuries ago, they're still impacting us.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that while all of this was happening, Black Americans weren't passive victims. They resisted, they fought back, they demanded their rights throughout history.
There's this incredible story about Gabriel Prosser. He planned this huge slave revolt in Virginia in 1800. It didn't succeed, but it shows how strong the desire for freedom was. People were willing to risk everything for it.
Right. And think about David Walker. His appeal, published in 1829, was basically a call to action. He urged enslaved people to rise up. These were acts of defiance, incredibly dangerous ones, and they show that spirit of resistance that's always been part of the Black community.
And it wasn't just about individual courage. The colored conventions, those gatherings organized by Black activists in the 19th century, those were powerful examples of collective action. They pushed for abolition, for civil rights. They challenged the whole idea of a society built on white supremacy.
Those conventions were amazing. Black leaders coming together, making plans, creating a shared vision for a better future.
And we can't forget the role of Black churches in this fight.
Mm.
They were often the only places where Black people could gather safely, organize, and strategize.
Yeah.
They offered a sense of community, of spiritual strength, of collective power.
They were like incubators for some of the most influential figures in the fight for racial justice. Think about Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and so many others. They found their voices. They honed their activism within those churches.
The backbone of the Black freedom struggle, absolutely. But the 1619 Project goes deeper than just politics and social movements. It also explores how racism has impacted Black Americans in really personal ways, things like healthcare and housing.
Right, and that's where we see the direct link between historical injustice and the inequality we see today. The disparities in healthcare and affordable housing for Black Americans, those aren't just bad luck. They're rooted in centuries of discrimination.
It's like this domino effect, the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow. It keeps rippling through these systems, creating obstacles that make it so much harder for Black Americans to thrive.
Take healthcare, for instance. From the very beginning, with the Freedmen's Bureau Medical Division struggling to provide decent care for formerly enslaved people, to the debates about healthcare today, Black Americans have always faced barriers to getting quality care.
And it's not just about access. It's about the quality of care. The story of Dr. Susan Moore, it's just heartbreaking. A Black physician who died from COVID-19 after alleging she was treated differently because of her race. It's a chilling example of how bias, even unconscious bias, can be a matter of life and death.
Her story is a tragic reminder that even in medicine, a field that's supposed to be about healing, racism can have devastating consequences.
And then there's housing, the legacy of redlining, of urban renewal that's created segregated neighborhoods, limited access to affordable housing for Black families. It's a direct line from the past to the disparities we see today.
And those disparities have a ripple effect. They impact education, jobs, access to healthy food, even exposure to environmental hazards. It's a cycle of disadvantage that's incredibly difficult to break.
The 1619 Project doesn't let us look away from the fact that these issues aren't isolated. They're symptoms of a much bigger problem, a systemic problem rooted in our history. It's a call to action, urging us to address these inequalities at their core.
Exactly. It's not enough to just see the problems. We have to understand how we got here and what we can do to create a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone.
As we keep going in our deep dive, keep this in mind. This history isn't just about the past. It's about now. It's about the future. It's about understanding how the legacy of slavery is still shaping our world and what we can do to dismantle the systems of oppression that are still holding so many people back.
And remember, the 1619 Project isn't just a history lesson, it's a challenge to re-examine our assumptions, to face uncomfortable truths, to commit ourselves to the fight for racial justice. It's a fight that's still going on. You know, as we dig deeper into the 1619 Project, there's this theme that keeps popping up. It's Black resilience, this unwavering pursuit of freedom in the face of centuries of oppression.
Yeah, it's really striking how Black Americans never gave up that fight throughout history, always pushing for their rightful place in this nation. The project showcases so many stories of resistance, big and small, what can you say?
Absolutely. From organized revolts like the one Gabriel Prosser led back in 1800 in Virginia to those everyday acts of defiance. The pursuit of liberty has been this constant thread. These stories really highlight the strength and determination of Black Americans.
Reading about those individuals, people who refused to accept their fate and just kept fighting for something better, it's truly inspiring. It's like even when the odds were completely stacked against them.
Yeah, one example that really stands out to me is David Walker and his appeal back in 1829. That was a bold move, right? A call for enslaved people to rise up against their oppressors. His words were a beacon of hope. And, they showed the power of Black thought and activism.
It makes you rethink that narrative that gets pushed sometimes, the one that paints enslaved people as just passive victims. The 1619 Project just blows that myth out of the water.
And it wasn't just about individual acts of defiance either. Remember those colored conventions? Black leaders gathering to push for abolition and civil rights. Those were truly remarkable. Imagine that. In a society that was trying to silence them, they came together, organizing, strategizing, raising their voices for equality.
It flips the script completely, shows that even with all that oppression, the desire for freedom and justice just couldn't be stamped out.
Right, and don't forget the Black churches, so vital in this struggle, providing space for community organizing, spiritual grounding, a place to resist. Those churches were sanctuaries, they were gathering places, and they were hubs for activism, fostering hope and solidarity when things were really tough.
It's so powerful. Those churches were more than just places of worship, right? They were like crucibles where social change was forged. We see leaders like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, so many others who found their voices and honed their activism in those spaces.
Absolutely. The 1619 Project really drives home how Black Americans have actively shaped this nation, its identity, its ideals, all throughout history.
Yeah, it's like Black history, IS American history, full stop. It pushes us to see beyond that traditional narrative and recognize how crucial Black Americans have been in shaping this country. What are your thoughts on how the project explores the relationship between Black and Native American communities?
Well, it's a complex history for sure, full of tension sometimes, but the project does a good job of showing those moments of solidarity too. It's a reminder that both groups have been marginalized and pitted against each other by systems of white supremacy.
I was really struck by the story of the Seminole Nation offering sanctuary to escaped slaves, incorporating them into their society. It's a powerful example of how those alliances challenged the racial hierarchy imposed by white colonizers.
Yeah, those examples of cross-racial solidarity are so important. They show that even in the face of oppression, people can find common ground and work together against injustice.
Exactly. It's a reminder that fighting for justice means building bridges and finding common cause with other marginalized groups. But the 1619 Project doesn't shy away from the tensions that existed either, right?
Absolutely. A lot of that tension stemmed from, government policies and actions that pitted these groups against each other, exploiting their vulnerabilities for their own gain. Take the forced removal of Native Americans from their lands, for example. Often that benefited white settlers, who then used enslaved African labor to cultivate those very lands.
Such a tragic example of how white supremacy has used those divide and conquer tactics to hold on to power. The project really compels us to confront these uncomfortable parts of history and recognize the need for deeper understanding and solidarity between groups who have been marginalized.
Yeah, it's a call for a more nuanced and inclusive approach to history, one that recognizes how interconnected these different communities' struggles for justice really are. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to how slavery impacted the development of American democracy, the political systems we live with today.
Huge topic, right? The 1619 Project really goes deep there, revealing how slavery had this profound and lasting impact on the very foundation of American democracy.
One of the most striking arguments they make is about the Constitution itself. It's hailed as this document of freedom and liberty, and yet it was also shaped in many ways by the need to protect the interests of those slaveholding states.
The Three-Fifths Compromise is a prime example, a compromise that dehumanized enslaved people, counting them as three-fifths of a person just for representation. Hard to believe that something like that could be enshrined in a document that's supposed to be about freedom and equality.
It really shows the power dynamics at work back then during the founding of this nation. This compromise, along with other provisions in the Constitution, gave those slaveholding states way more power than they should have had in the federal government. It ensured that slavery would continue and shape the political landscape for decades to come.
It's a real wake-up call, a reminder that ideals like freedom and equality often clashed with the realities of power and self-interest during those early days of the U.S. How does the project connect all of this to modern politics?
They trace the lasting legacy of that compromise, arguing that it's had a major impact on American political thought, shaping our ideas about citizenship, states' rights, the very nature of democracy itself. That fear of federal interference with slavery, which was central to the compromise, you can still see it resonating in today's political debates. Issues like voting rights, federal power, racial justice.
So we're still dealing with the consequences of these compromises made centuries ago.
Absolutely. The 1619 Project makes us re-examine the foundation of American democracy, challenging us to confront how slavery and its legacy continue to shape our political institutions, how power operates in this country.
It's a call to action to acknowledge this history and work to dismantle the systems that keep inequality alive.
Exactly. The pursuit of a more perfect union, that's a process.
Right.
And it requires a critical look at our past, a commitment to dismantling those remnants of slavery that are still holding back progress towards a more just and equitable society. The project also sheds light on some lesser-known aspects of slavery, like the sugar trade, its horrific impact on enslaved Africans.
Yeah, that was really difficult to read. The descriptions of the conditions on those sugar plantations, the brutality, it's just gut-wrenching.
It's a chapter in our history that often gets overlooked, but the project reveals the horrific reality of sugar production. Backbreaking work, deadly conditions, inhumane punishments.
It's easy to forget sometimes when we think about slavery that it wasn't just an economic system. It was a system built on terror, violence, dehumanization. And the project connects that history to today, looking at how the legacy of the sugar trade is still impacting Black communities.
You're exactly right. From the disproportionate rates of diabetes and other health problems to the way Black sugarcane workers are still exploited, the project highlights the lasting consequences of that brutal chapter in American history.
It makes you think about what you're buying, what you're consuming, and the systems behind all of it. The sugar trade is just one example, but it's a reminder to be mindful of those systems and push for ethical and sustainable practices.
For sure. And the project also gets into something else that's often overlooked: the history of racial classifications, how they were used to justify oppression, to create a hierarchy of human value.
It's mind-boggling how these categories, which are basically made up, have had such a huge and lasting impact on people's lives.
The project traces that evolution of racial categories from the early colonial days up to the present, showing how they're not fixed or natural but constructed, designed to serve specific political and economic agendas.
So race isn't a biological fact, it's a tool used for social control.
Exactly. And the project highlights how these classifications have been used to justify everything. Slavery, segregation, discrimination, creating the system where whiteness is at the top and Blackness is devalued.
It's a reminder to be critical of the categories we use to understand the world, to see how they can be used to perpetuate injustice.
The project also explores how those classifications still shape society today. They influence everything: housing patterns, education, interactions with law enforcement.
It's everywhere, isn't it? Those invisible lines that divide us and shape our experiences. The 1619 Project makes us face the fact that those categories aren't harmless. They have real consequences.
It's a call to action, to dismantle these made-up categories and build a society where all people are treated with dignity and respect, no matter the color of their skin.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, right? And challenging any system that tries to divide us based on arbitrary distinctions.
Yeah.
Speaking of challenging systems, the 1619 Project doesn't hold back on tackling the sexual exploitation of Black women under slavery.
A difficult topic, no question, but an essential one. And the project handles it with sensitivity and nuance. It reveals how Black women's bodies were controlled, violated, dehumanized.
It's a stark reminder that slavery wasn't just forced labor. It was about power, domination, asserting white supremacy over every aspect of Black lives.
Yeah. The project explores how white supremacy created this culture of impunity where white men could assault Black women without consequence.
This wasn't just a personal violation. It was a tool used to dominate, to control Black women, terrorize families, reinforce that racial hierarchy.
And the project traces that legacy, highlighting how it still impacts Black women today.
Think about how Black women are hypersexualized in the media, the disproportionate rates of sexual assault and domestic violence they experience. The project shows the consequences of that history. It's a call to confront how Black women's bodies are still objectified, commodified, violated.
We need to work towards a future where they're treated with dignity, respect, and autonomy. This goes beyond just understanding history. It's about dismantling the systems that perpetuate these injustices in the present.
Yeah, it's about recognizing how interconnected all of this is. The legacy of slavery lives on in how we think, how we act, how we treat each other. The 1619 Project shines a light on those truths and challenges us to do better.
It's a powerful testament to the resilience, creativity, and spirit of Black Americans. They faced unimaginable adversity, and yet
it pushes us to confront our history, to grapple with the present, and to work towards a future that's just and equitable for everyone.
And it reminds us that the fight for Black liberation isn't just a Black issue. It's an American issue, and it demands our attention, our empathy, our action. One of the things that really struck me about the 1619 Project is how it connects all these seemingly different parts of American history. It shows how the legacy of slavery is still shaping our political landscape today.
It's not just about events from the past, right?
Hmm.
It's about understanding how those events created the power structures, the political ideas that still govern us. One thing that really stood out was how the project explores the way that protecting slavery influenced the development of American political thought.
It's a perspective we don't often hear. We think of political ideologies as these abstract concepts, but the project shows how they're often rooted in very real self-serving interests.
Like the whole debate over tariffs in the early 19th century, right? The project shows how Southern politicians, those who were fiercely protective of slavery, saw tariffs as a direct threat to their economic and political power.
Those Southern leaders, people like John C. Calhoun, they had a huge influence on the political landscape. They pushed for states' rights, limited government, not because of some grand principle, but to protect slavery from federal interference.
So it wasn't really about small government, it was about protecting a system of oppression.
Exactly. And the project traces those ideas through history, showing how they connect to political movements even today.
It's fascinating, but also a little unsettling to see how those ideas keep popping up in different forms throughout history.
Think about the Tea Party movement. Their emphasis on limited government, states' rights, it echoes a lot of the arguments made by those pro-slavery advocates back in the 19th century. It's like history is rhyming, repeating itself in these new and often disturbing ways.
And the project links that to what's happening today. The efforts to restrict voting rights, especially those targeting Black and brown communities.
Right. Things like gerrymandering, voter ID laws, they're often presented as being race neutral, but we know who they really impact.
It's a reminder that the fight for equal access to the ballot box, a fight that's been going on for generations, it's far from over. We can't get complacent.
The 1619 Project forces us to look at American politics with fresh eyes, to see the lasting impact of slavery on our institutions and even our political conversations.
It's a call to be vigilant, to challenge any attempts to disenfranchise and marginalize communities of color, to build a truly inclusive and equitable democracy.
You know what really hit home for me in the 1619 Project? Those personal stories, the way they bring the project's themes to life. Statistics and historical analysis are important, but those personal accounts add this depth of emotion and understanding that really resonated.
Totally agree. You can read about the impact of slavery on Black families, but hearing those stories told in their own words, it hits different.
Like the story about the Bowlings family. They built this successful business in Alabama, but they were met with violence, economic ruin. It's a tragic example of the systemic barriers that Black Americans have faced trying to build prosperity.
Heartbreaking, but it also shows their resilience, their determination to succeed despite incredible odds.
And the story of Dr. Susan Moore, the Black physician who died from COVID-19 after alleging she experienced racist treatment from medical staff, that one's a chilling reminder of how systemic racism can show up even in fields like medicine, a field that's supposed to be about healing. And the consequences are devastating.
Her story really got to me. It shows that even in professions dedicated to healing, racial bias can have deadly consequences.
Those personal stories remind us that the legacy of slavery isn't some abstract thing. It's real life for millions of Black Americans, shaping their lives, their opportunities in profound ways.
That's where the 1619 Project goes beyond just an intellectual exercise, It touches your heart and challenges you to see the world through the eyes of people who have been marginalized and oppressed.
And of course, we can't talk about the 1619 Project without mentioning its exploration of Black music. It's brilliant how it highlights the central role music has played in the Black experience in America.
I love how the project makes you rethink musical genres like blues, jazz, and gospel. It shows their origins in the lived experiences of Black Americans.
These forms of music weren't just entertainment. They were a way for Black communities to express their pain, their joy, their hopes, their struggles. Music became this form of resistance, a way to hold on to cultural identity, a source of strength when times were tough.
Those spirituals sung by enslaved people, they were more than just religious songs. They were messages of hope, of freedom, of resistance, coded messages.
And then you have the blues, born out of the Jim Crow South, giving voice to the pain of segregation, discrimination, economic hardship. All these musical genres, they're a testament to the creative spirit and resilience of Black people who faced unimaginable adversity.
But the project also explores the flip side of that, doesn't it? The way Black music has been appropriated and commercialized by the dominant culture, often without credit or compensation for the artists who created it.
It's a reminder that even as Black music has enriched American culture, it's also been exploited.
The 1619 Project encourages us to listen to Black music differently, to appreciate its historical and cultural significance, to recognize the genius of Black artists, and to challenge the systems that exploit them.
Well, absolutely. Celebrate that creativity while also acknowledging the ways it's been used and sometimes misused in the American story.
Well, we've covered a lot today. This deep dive into the 1619 Project has been truly eye-opening. It's made me think about American history in a new way, forced me to face some uncomfortable truths about our nation's past and present.
I agree. It's a monumental work. It reframes American history, centering the legacy of slavery and its impact. It's a project that pushes us to think critically, to embrace complexity, and to work towards a more just and equitable future for everyone.
It's something that will stay with me long after we're done here. I encourage everyone listening to check it out, explore its insights. It's a conversation starter, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that the fight for racial justice is far from over.
It's just one piece of the puzzle, too. There are so many other stories, perspectives, voices that need to be heard as we continue to grapple with the legacy of slavery and the ongoing struggle for racial equity in America.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going, and keep fighting for a better future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Make sure to subscribe to the deep dive and share this episode with your friends. We're constantly exploring new and challenging ideas, things that make you question what you think you know.
And we've included a purchase link for the book in the show notes, just for you. Keep those minds sharp and never stop questioning. Until next time.